Hello everyone, my name is Vasiliki Dimitriadi from geoengineer.org. I'm pleased to introduce you to April's 2015 online lecture organized by the International Society for Soil Mechanics and Geotechnical Engineering. This month, Professor Kubrinovsky will be talking about the impacts of liquefaction in the 2010-2011 Christchurch earthquakes. Mr. Kubrinovsky is a professor of geotechnical earthquake engineering at the University of Canterbury, Christchurch, New Zealand. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and received his PhD in geotechnical engineering from the University of Tokyo in 1993. Over his 30-year-long career, he has obtained considerable expertise in geotechnical earthquake engineering and more specifically in problems associated with liquefaction, seismic response of earth structures, and soil structure interaction. He has a long publication record with over 250 peer-reviewed publications and has delivered over 30 keynote and invited presentations. Professor Kubrinovsky has had a major leadership role in the research and recovery efforts following the 2010-2011 Christchurch earthquakes, and he is the chair of the 6th International Conference on Earthquake Geotechnical Engineering to be held this November in Christchurch, New Zealand. Note that after the completion of the webinar, Professor Kubrinovsky will be happy to answer any questions posted on the ISSMGE Q&A platform. The platform will remain active for 2 days. It is located below the present video, and you may access it with your GeoWorld account. Enjoy the lecture.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this ISSMGE webinar on the impacts of liquefaction in the 2010-2011 Christchurch, New Zealand earthquakes. As you have heard in the introduction, I am Miško Kubrinovsky from the University of Canterbury, Christchurch, someone who has lived through these earthquakes not only professionally but also as a resident of the city of Christchurch. I've identified here 4 defining features of the Christchurch earthquakes in terms of their impacts on physical infrastructure and people. The first one is related to soil liquefaction. The earthquakes triggered widespread liquefaction over nearly half of the city area, causing tremendous damage and significant impacts on the residents of Christchurch. The second feature is also geotechnical in nature and is related to the rockfalls and slope instabilities that were triggered in the port hills along the southeastern perimeter of the city, affecting residential areas and causing some fatalities. These 2 geotechnical failures were very difficult to deal with, caused tremendous damage and also long-term impacts on the residents of Christchurch. The third significant feature is related to the closure of the central part of the city, the Central Business District, or the CBD, where most of the multi-story buildings, businesses, and social activities were concentrated. The earthquakes caused heavy damage of the CBD buildings, and most of the fatalities occurred due to the collapse of 2 buildings. And because of the heavy damage to the buildings, the CBD was closed to public access to allow first for rescue missions and then to allow for demolition of a large number of buildings. Nearly 2,000 buildings were demolished, and the CBD was cordoned off for 2.5 years, creating significant impacts on businesses and the community as a whole. So all of this should be placed in the context of not a single earthquake, but several strong earthquakes repeatedly hitting Christchurch and indeed testing the resilience of buildings, infrastructure, and the residents of Christchurch. So I'm going to focus on the impacts of liquefaction in these earthquakes, and we'll first briefly discuss the key characteristics of the Christchurch earthquakes, and then we'll follow with the discussion on the characteristics and manifestation of liquefaction and lateral spreading, followed by their impacts on buildings and infrastructure, including a little bit about residential land and buildings, multi-story CBD buildings, bridges, and pipe networks such as the wastewater and potable water systems of Christchurch. Since the presentation is very dense and contains lots of information, I'm going to provide some summary remarks on these topics as discussed, and then we'll have brief general concluding remarks at the end of the talk. So let's start with the characteristics of the Canterbury earthquakes. This is New Zealand. Here is the North Island, and this is the South Island, and we can see clearly here some tectonic features. There is a subduction zone between the Pacific plate and the Australian plate, at the northeast, and another subduction zone between these two plates at southwest. There is a complex system of faults between the two subduction zones, and the dominant feature here is the Alpine Fault, which runs along the South Island. These are all sources capable of generating earthquakes with large magnitudes of magnitude 8 and slightly above 8. But we are going to focus on the Canterbury Plains here and Christchurch, which is on the east coast in the central part of the South Island. Christchurch was established in the 1850s and is currently the second largest city of New Zealand, with a population of about 390,000 and an area of approximately 450 square kilometers. We are now zooming in on the Canterbury Plains. So here is Christchurch, and this is the central business district where the multi-story buildings are concentrated. The rest of Christchurch is predominantly residential, with single-story houses and some two-story houses. There are two major rivers in the plains, and the Waimakariri River is particularly important because it regularly flooded Christchurch before its diversion to the north. The plains are composed of very thick deposits of gravels and sands interbedded with fine-grained soils. About 6,000 years ago, the coastline was somewhere here, just to the west of the CBD. Now, these hundreds of meters thick soil deposits practically obscure any manifestation of seismic faults on the ground surface of the plains, and therefore, even though such faults were anticipated, the earthquakes in 2010 and 2011 occurred on previously unknown faults. The activity started with the Darfield earthquake on 4 September 2010 with a magnitude 7.1 earthquake generating along this complex system of faults with source to CBD distance of about 20 kilometers, and this earthquake caused a moderate damage in the city, including a relatively extensive liquefaction. It was then followed by the most devastating earthquakes on 22nd February 2011, a magnitude 6.2 event with the source area here, and this earthquake caused tremendous damage to the CBD, unfortunately 185 fatalities and widespread liquefaction and very severe liquefaction over nearly half of the city area. The third major earthquake occurred on 13th of June 2011, actually a couple of earthquakes with magnitudes 5.3 and 6 occurring in this source area, and then eventually we've got on 23rd of December 2011 the fourth event, again a couple of earthquakes with magnitudes 5.8 and 5.9. What is evident is that all these earthquakes have sources within the city boundaries, and hence their effects were very damaging because they produce very severe ground motions. This kind of unzipping of faults and seismic activity is not unusual from a seismological perspective, but it was highly unusual that an urban center was affected repeatedly by very strong earthquakes with sources within its boundaries. And this slide shows the cumulative impact of earthquakes. Here each earthquake is shown by its epicenter, and we can see indeed that the sources of these earthquakes were within the city suburbs, and in particular the February 22nd earthquake produced a heavy damage and extremely violent ground shaking. So these are the acceleration time history records obtained at the Christchurch Botanic Garden, which is just west of the CBD. So these are representative of the ground shaking produced by the earthquakes in the September 2010, February 2011, June 2011 and December 2011. It is immediately obvious that the accelerations were exceptionally high during the February event, with peak ground accelerations of about 0.6 G. In all other events, however, we can also see reasonably high PGAs of 0.15 to 0.2 G, and these are all damaging levels of ground accelerations, and indeed in all these events liquefaction was induced. but of course particularly damaging was this event on the 22nd February 2011, which we can consider as an extreme event. So these are now acceleration time histories recorded during the 22nd February earthquake throughout Christchurch by a dense array of strong motion instruments. A close inspection of some of these acceleration traces is showing long period motions, which are typical for liquefaction, as well as some acceleration spikes, which are typical for cyclic mobility during the dilative phase in the effective stress path, and butterfly oscillating loops near the zero effective stress state. So some evidence of liquefaction and cyclic mobility is apparent in the acceleration records themselves. The numbers next to these traces show the peak ground accelerations, or PGAs, associated with each of the records, and we can see that in the CBD the PGAs were very high, from 0.5 G to 0.75 G, and similar levels of accelerations were also recorded in the eastern part of the city. You can see here the source zone, and the distance is only 2-3 kilometers, so therefore the accelerations are so high in those areas. It is common in liquefaction evaluation to quantify the seismic demand using the cyclic stress ratio, or CSR, which is then normalized to an equivalent magnitude 7.5. So we have calculated CSR 7.5 at shallow depth at the water table, and in such case this CSR value is actually a function only of the PGAs and the magnitude of the earthquake. So using this data, it was easy to calculate CSR 7.5 values at the water table, which in this case we will see is very shallow at 1 or 2 meters depth, and we've got very high CSR values from 0.15 to 0.3. So here is a better illustration of the seismic demand created by this earthquake for structures through the use of response spectra, and for soils, or demand specific to liquefaction, by using a conventional liquefaction triggering chart based on CPT. On the spectrum we can see the spectrum of the ground motion at the Christchurch Botanic Garden, shown with the blue line, and it's compared here with the smooth lines indicating the design response spectra. These are the design levels that were used for designing buildings before the earthquakes. And it is apparent that the ground motions generated by the February earthquake far exceeded the design levels, and this explains the heavy damage that was observed in the CBD, on the buildings in the CBD. On the liquefaction triggering chart, we have the CSR 7.5 versus the CPT tip resistance. This is actually normalized CPT tip resistance, QC1N, for clean sand, and it shows the empirical relationship where the liquefaction resistance increases with the increase in the tip resistance, or if you like, with increase in the density of the soil. And again, here we have the seismic demand caused in terms of CSR by the 22nd February earthquake, from 0.15 to 0.3 CSR values, which far exceed the liquefaction resistance of low to medium soils with low to medium penetration resistance, or soils with low to medium densities, if you like. So this is clearly showing that the seismic demand was exceptionally high, both for buildings as well as for liquefiable soils. And as we are going to see, many of the soils in Christchurch actually have a very low liquefaction resistance, so the widespread liquefaction that occurred during this event was not unexpected. So in summary, unfortunately the February event caused also 185 fatalities, and it caused the complete destruction of the CBD. As I mentioned, nearly 70% of the buildings, or approximately 2,000 buildings, have been demolished. The earthquakes also caused tremendous damage due to liquefaction, widespread liquefaction affecting 60,000 residential properties, out of which 20,000 were severely affected and 8,000 were abandoned because it was considered uneconomic to reinstate those areas as residential areas. The liquefaction also shattered the lifelines of Christchurch. For example, the wastewater system was had loss of service or limited service over approximately 700 kilometers, and there were over 4,000 breaks on the potable water pipes. The liquefaction also caused heavy damage to roads and bridges, and lateral spreading was particularly damaging for areas close to waterways. The total economic loss inflicted by these earthquakes is estimated at 40 billion New Zealand dollars, or approximately 20% of the New Zealand's GDP. And a simple calculation suggests that nearly 50% of these losses, or approximately close to $20 billion, was due to ground failures and liquefaction in particular. In order to better understand characteristics of the Christchurch liquefaction, I am going to provide a very brief overview of the geology and ground conditions in Christchurch. As I mentioned previously, the plains are built of very thick deposits of gravel and sand layers interbedded. So these are gravel and sand layers interbedded with fine-grained soils. And they are forming a complex interbedded formation with gravel aquifers and with artesian water pressures. It is estimated that there are approximately 10,000 wells have been sunk in the area of Christchurch since 1860s, sourcing water from 20 to 200 meters deep wells. So for the liquefaction evaluation, we are going to focus on the near surface soils in the top 20 to 40 meters. And this is an east-west cross section. So here is the coast, and this is the sea level. And at the west edge of the city, the elevation is about 25 meters above the sea level. And then we have a very gently sloping ground towards the ocean. 25 meters elevation difference over 17 kilometers length. So the surface alluvial soils overlie the topmost gravel, the Riccarton gravel, which is a gravel of an older age, 15 to 70,000 years old, is also the uppermost aquifer. The thickness of the alluvial deposits, or depth to Riccarton gravel, is about 10 meters in the west part of the city, 20 to 25 meters in the CBD, and about 40 meters at the eastern edge of the city. Because of the issues with aquifers and potential water contamination, the CBD buildings are typically on shallow foundations or on pile foundations which are within the alluvial deposits, so the tips of the piles do not reach the deeper and more competent gravel layers. The water table is at 5 to 7 meters depth in the western part of the city, and then is becoming progressively shallow. It is within the top meter or two from the ground surface in the CBD, and is also very shallow to the east, in the eastern suburbs of Christchurch. And this is apparent in this slide, where median depth to water table is shown, and bluish colors, which are predominant in this slide, actually indicate very shallow water table at the ground surface 1 or up to 2 meters depth. So most of the soils are fully saturated close to the ground surface. Two dominant features at present in Christchurch are the Avon River, shown here, and the Hitchcock River to the southern part of the city. And these rivers originate from the western springs in Christchurch and then meander through the city and discharge in the Avon-Hitchcock estuary. As we are going to see later, Particularly heavy was the liquefaction along the Avon River. This is how Brown and Weber describe the city of Christchurch in their excellent study on the geology of Christchurch. They're saying originally the site of Christchurch was mainly swamp, estuaries and lagoons, gravel, sand and silt of river channel and flood deposits. Waimakere River regularly flooded Christchurch, and since European settlement in the 1850s, extensive drainage and infilling of swamps has been undertaken. Using data from their study, we prepared this plot where the age of the soils was estimated based on radiocarbon dating of soil samples and is plotted against the depth of the samples. The plot is showing that in the top 5, 6, 7 meters the soils are relatively young, less than 2,000 years old, and in the shallower parts we can see some soils which are only a few hundred years old. So in summary, by their composition as fine sands or silty sands with low plasticity or non-plastic fines, deposited at low densities or medium densities associated with a fluvial depositional environment, fully saturated with a very high water table close to the ground surface, and a relatively young age. These are all factors pointing out to a very high liquefaction potential. One may also argue that the intense groundwater regime and water flow prevented some beneficial aging effects from developing and increasing the liquefaction resistance, which otherwise would have occurred in a more stable and less disturbing ground environment. So, having in mind the very high seismic demand on one hand and the very high potential for liquefaction of these soils, it wasn't a surprise that the very severe shaking produced by the February earthquake caused extensive liquefaction throughout Christchurch. Following this earthquake, we've conducted a drive-through reconnaissance, and in order to document the manifestation of liquefaction throughout the city. So the red lines here indicate areas where the manifestation was moderate to severe. Liquefaction manifestation was moderate to severe. Yellow lines indicate low to moderate manifestation. Green symbols indicate traces of liquefaction, and clean blue lines indicate roads where there wasn't evidence of liquefaction. So we can see some moderate to severe liquefaction occurring along the Avon River. It's important to emphasize that this is a generalized map and that liquefaction manifestation is very non-uniform, and the red color here actually indicates that the predominant impression was that the liquefaction in that area was of moderate to severe intensity. But of course there were areas within these red lines where the liquefaction was low, or even there was absence of liquefaction. So these are generalized maps that cannot be used on a property basis. So here are some images from Christchurch illustrating the severity of liquefaction and manifestation in the worst affected suburbs. Approximately 20,000 properties were severely affected, and this is typical manifestation on such properties, where we can see here a huge sand boil covering almost the entire residential property. And this is how most of the streets in the eastern suburbs looked like, with piles of sand and silt after the cleanup of the properties. Over 500,000 tons of sands and silt ejected were removed in the partial cleanup of the city. So here is again the same map, but now shown as area map, with red indicating moderate to severe liquefaction and yellow indicating low to moderate liquefaction. So these are areas that liquefied during the February event, and the white shaded areas are areas that liquefied in the previous September 2000 event, whereas the black shaded areas are areas that liquefied in the subsequent June 2011 event. So we can see many parts along the Avon River exhibited repeated severe liquefaction in multiple events. And I'm going to show several examples of the manifestation of reliquefaction. So this is the Porritt Park along the Avon River, where we can see very large sand boils covering the park, and this is how the same area looked like after this is after the September event, and this is how the whole area looked like after the February event, where the size of the area covered by sand boils has practically doubled. This is the one street in the Avonside area which was repeatedly hit by severe liquefaction. This is actually a major liquefaction number 3 occurring during the third major event in June 2011. And this photo was taken just 2 hours after the earthquake, so you can see some fresh sand boils and still water is covering the streets. Probably the best evidence for the effects of liquefaction were obtained for this property at the Avonside here, where my colleague Mark Quigley documented the liquefaction in the backyard of the property. So you can see here significant sand boils covering the backyard of the property after the September 2010 liquefaction. And there is a clear feature, cracks and fissures through which the water and sand and silts were reaching the ground surface and forming this line that goes towards the door of this shed. They cleaned up the property, and then this is what happened in the second event, February 2011. We are seeing exactly the same alignment of these sand volcanoes along the same crack or feature, which obviously served as a pathway for water and sand ejecta in the subsequent event. They cleaned up the property again, and we are seeing now very small evidence of liquefaction, traces of liquefaction during a minor event, magnitude 5 event on April 16, 2011. And then there was the 13th of June event, first magnitude 5.3, and then magnitude 6 80 minutes later. So we can see repeated liquefaction with very severe manifestation of sand boils, and pretty much same features are appearing along which the water and sand ejecta are reaching the ground surface. So this is not surprising. Clearly, liquefaction results in a very non-uniform ground deformation. It also creates some weaknesses, especially in the surface parts of the deposits, cracks and fissures, and creates pathways for water and sand ejected to reach the ground surface in subsequent events. Also, if we think about the liquefaction process, it is associated with significant seepage action and water flow, which surely disturbs the soils near the ground surface. We also know that following liquefaction, the soils are going to resolidify and reconsolidate under gravity loads and going to get densities that are not very high. So the density of the soil deposit after liquefaction is going to be medium density, not very high. And we also know that the fabric of these soils is going to be very weak and highly susceptible to reliquefaction. So, and of course, the behavioral age of the deposit is going to be reset to 0, because liquefaction is going to erase any beneficial effects of aging in terms of increase in strength and stiffness. So all of these factors are pointing out to really a reduced liquefaction resistance, or at least at best the same liquefaction resistance as before the first event, and are also pointing out that we should not expect any improvement in the performance of land or structures in previously liquefied soils. I'm mentioning this because quite often liquefaction is associated with substantial settlements, and these settlements are often interpreted as ground and densification of the liquefied soils, and then there is this assumption that for that reason the liquefaction resistance should increase after a liquefaction event. I think we have abundant evidence from Christchurch as well as the previous reasoning that I just outlined that we should not expect any improvement in the liquefaction resistance or performance of structures on previously liquefied soils, especially in cases when the liquefaction caused heavy disturbance of the soils near the surface. So this is now a summary LiDAR data showing the total settlements that occurred in Christchurch over the period from September 2010 to December 2011. And red color indicates large settlements, some subsidence from 0.5 to 1 meter. We can see that those are areas typically very close to the Avon River or to estuaries. Such large subsidence and settlements occurred really in areas that don't have lateral confinement, and often were associated with slumping modes of deformation, which included some lateral expansion and vertical settlement. So Bexley is one of those areas, which is just adjacent to the estuary, and you can see the subsidence here of 1 meter completely changed the elevation in relation to the water in the estuary and significantly increased the flooding hazard for this area. So this increase in the risk for flooding in conjunction with the serious effects of lateral spreading which were prevalent in these areas were really the two factors why these areas were abandoned and declared as red zone residential areas. This is now a typical soil profile along the Avon River where severe liquefaction was manifested, and there are about 2 meters of sandy silt and silty sand near the ground surface, overlying a finer sand deposit. So we can see here low tip resistances for the silty sand and ISSMGE soil behavior type index or ISSMGE values somewhere between 2 and 2.45, and then the tip resistance slightly increases in the fine sand and ISSMGE drops to a value of about 1.8. So critical layers for liquefaction were these fine sands and some of the silty sands, and there was severe manifestation of liquefaction when there was this kind of thick liquefiable sand deposit, continuous sand deposit. In the southern parts of the city, more common are stratified layers where we have liquefiable layers sandwiched between non-liquefiable layers or silty soils with ISSMGE values close to the threshold. And it was observed that in such cases the manifestation was much smaller and the damaging effects of liquefaction were significantly reduced. So this is one important difference between severe liquefaction and deep continuous liquefiable soil profiles versus smaller manifestation in cases of interlayered profiles with liquefiable and non-liquefiable soils. Another important feature and effect was the presence of non-liquefiable crust at the ground surface, and there was clear evidence in Christchurch that a thick non-liquefiable crust that preserves the integrity of the capping layer and the horizontal stiffness of this layer was reducing the manifestation and damaging effects of liquefaction. And this is in line with the well-known conceptual chart of Ishihara from the 1985, which suggests the same thing and the influence of the non-liquefiable crust layer on the manifestation and damaging effects of liquefaction on the ground surface. So Lateral spreading was surely the most damaging phenomenon associated with liquefaction, affecting roads, bridges, buildings, and residential houses. It was typically confined and occurred along rivers, streams, waterways, old river channels, and swamps, and typically affected a zone about 50 to 200 meters away from the waterway. So I'm going to use our observations of lateral spreading from the town of Kaiapoi, a small town just north of Christchurch, which was severely affected by lateral spreading during the September 2010 earthquake. So here is South Kaiapoi, and the spreading of this area was going towards the Courtney stream here, whereas in the North Kaiapoi the spreading was towards the Kaiapoi River. They exhibited very different lateral spreading patterns were observed in these two areas, so I'm going to point out some of these differences. We did ground surveying and conducted very detailed measurements of lateral spreading displacements along these transects, red lines. We would first identify cracks on the ground surface and then measure the width of the cracks to develop this kind of plots where we have the permanent lateral displacement plotted against the distance from the waterway. So we are seeing here two very different distribution patterns. This is North Kaiapoi, where we can see that permanent lateral spreading displacements at the river banks were somewhere between 0.5 meter and 3 meters, and those displacements were decreasing with an exponential decay, which is a typical reduction and typical pattern of lateral spreading displacements. The spreading affected an area of approximately 1 to 200 meters. We are seeing a very different distribution pattern of lateral spreading displacement in South Kaiapoi, where practically a block of soil of about 150 to 200 meters adjacent to the river moved towards the river for about 1.5 to 2 meters, and the largest cracks opened behind that block. So those large cracks are indicated with these sharp reductions in displacements at a distance between 150 and 200 meters. And unfortunately, these large cracks and openings in the ground due to block failure movement associated with spreading occurred just where the houses were along the Courtney Drive, and these cracks were practically running through houses and rupturing the houses as shown here. Fortunately, the New Zealand houses are timber framed houses. They are very ductile and they can accommodate large deformation without collapse, and practically there wasn't any collapse in these areas despite the extreme ground deformation and demands. So this is surely one of the success stories from the Christchurch earthquakes. So we've conducted this kind of ground surveying measurements along a large number of transects, about 150 in total, and I'm showing here those measurements along the Avon River, where red lines indicate measurements after the September earthquake, and blue indicate measurements after the February earthquake. Now each of those transects would have a summary data of this nature, where we are having measured ground displacements as a function from the distance from the waterway, and there are two lines here. One is for the September event and the other is for the February event. Then we have the ground slope before and after the earthquake. And then we have a number of CPTs defining the typical soil profiles and which we use to conduct a more detailed liquefaction analysis and identify the critical layers that were responsible for spreading movements. In that analysis, we would also use details on ground displacements obtained from LiDAR, which provides some global patterns of movements, unlike our localized measurements along the transect. So this kind of data has been summarized And we first eliminated all areas where very complex pattern of spreading were observed and tried to look into the simple ones and identified 3 typical patterns of movements and magnitudes of ground displacements. So here is what we call large and distributed ground displacements. So the spreading displacement in this case was anywhere between 0.5 meter and 1.5 meter, and the distance affected by spreading was up to 100 or 200 meters from the river. The second type of pattern of spreading was we still have large lateral spreading displacements at the river bank of about 1 meter, 1.5, but then they are really confined within a narrow zone of about 20, 30, 40 meters from the river. And finally, the third pattern is when the spreading displacements are relatively small, less than 30 centimeters, and quite often negligible. In these areas, we've identified 2 critical layers. One was a silty soil, typically with low penetration resistance and a tip resistance of 2 to 4 megapascals, and ISSMGE values somewhere around 2.1 to 2.4, and this layer was shallow, immediately below the water table. The second critical layer was a fine sand layer, again with low tip resistance of 4 to 8 megapascals, and ISSMGE values around 1.8 to 2. So we found some commonalities in relation to these critical layers for these 3 different patterns of lateral spreading displacements. In cases when the thickness of the critical layers was large and these layers were continuous along the river as well as away from the river, and there was even mild gentle slope towards the river, either of the surface or of the base of that critical layer, we would observe this kind of large ground displacements. On the other hand, large ground displacements but with limited extent were observed in cases where these layers were not continuous beyond certain distance from the river. And finally, in cases when the critical layers were thin, 30 to 50, 60 centimeters only, and they were discontinuous both along the river and with the distance from the river, and when they were horizontal or sloping away from the river, then in those cases the spreading displacements would be very small. And we've noticed that along Hitchcock River we observed same pattern of relatively small lateral spreading displacements for the same reason. So it seems to me that this kind of approach where a geotechnical analysis and mechanics-based approach is really needed to evaluate lateral spreadings and follow this line of questioning. Is lateral spreading a possibility or not? If yes, then are these spreading displacements going to be large or small? And obviously there are certain key factors that affect the magnitude of those displacements, including continuity of layers. Once we understand that, the next is to really identify what will be the distance affected by the spreading, which can be quite different, and finally the distribution of displacements, because they are eventually used to identify differential ground movements and strains that are used actually in the design for structures that are within the lateral spreading zone. So at the end of this part on lateral spreading, just to mention the very complex patterns of spreading that were observed in meandering loops, and just one feature to highlight here. So this is the meandering loop at Darlington, where in the internal part where we have point part deposits, there were large spreading displacements. These are now in centimeters, so roughly 1 meter of lateral spreading movements towards the river. Whereas on the opposite side, at the cut bank, where the soils are better, the spreading movements were very small or practically negligible. So this is the difference in the approaches to this bridge. This is on the point bar side, where the settlement associated with spreading was close to 1 meter, whereas on the cut bank side, just 30 meters across on the opposite side of the bridge, the approach was showing very little ground distortion because the spreading movements were very small in that area. The second part of this presentation is going to focus on the effects and impacts of liquefaction on buildings and infrastructure, and we'll start first with residential buildings. New Zealand has a very high earthquake insurance coverage. For example, the residential properties and buildings were covered at approximately 90% of the cases in Christchurch. What is unusual and unique is that we have insurance coverage not only for the residential buildings but also for residential land. So for that reason, the agency in charge of the earthquake insurance, the Earthquake Commission or EQC, and their engineers, Tonkin and Taylor, performed very detailed inspections to document damage to land and foundations inflicted in during the 2010-2011 earthquakes. So this is the summary of such inspections on the land damage, where red color indicates moderate to very severe land damage and green indicates minor to moderate land damage. We can see that by and large the areas of worst land damage occur where we've observed a severe manifestation of liquefaction. These are now the results from the damage inspections on foundations, where major foundation damage is shown in red, moderate foundation damage is in orange, and then green is minor and blue is none. And gray shows areas that were not inspected for foundation damage because there wasn't any apparent land damage in those areas. The worst damage, again, for covering all four major earthquake events, occurred along Avon River, and that damage was associated mostly with lateral spreading. As mentioned previously, residential houses in Christchurch are typically timber frame structures, and here we can see the two prevalent foundation types. Concrete slab on grade is one of those, and the second is continuous perimeter footing. In the case of single-story buildings on concrete slab, the slab is only 100 millimeters thick and it has no reinforcement except near the edges with the foundation beam. The perimeter footing has different details depending on the age of construction. Prevalent are concrete perimeter footings with different reinforcing details. There is a timber floor supported on the perimeter footing with some additional floor supports internally as indicated here, and these supports are loosely connected to the timber floor, so they cannot really provide any lateral resistance or they don't have lateral load carrying capacity. So the foundations really have deficiencies in terms of accommodating large ground displacements or associated with liquefaction or spreading loads associated with lateral spreading. But we have to put these foundations in the context of the historical development of Christchurch, where these structures were really developed well before the birth of earthquake engineering or any engineering considerations of soil liquefaction. Because of the large flexibility and deformability of these foundations, the buildings exhibited a range of different modes of total settlement, differential, tilt and settlement, extensional deformation and rupture, and different shapes in distortion of the houses as indicated in this schematic plot. So this is a typical manifestation of liquefaction-induced damage with differential settlement causing propagation of damage in the superstructure, damage to the concrete slab and cracks due to the lack of reinforcement, or rupture of reinforcement in the foundation beam due to insufficient reinforcement to prevent in areas subjected to lateral spreading. Now again, we need to put this in context of very severe effects of liquefaction. As shown here, in many areas the ejecta was half a meter thick, and quite often the ejecta completely covered the interior of the house, as shown on these photos. We've conducted detailed investigations for 40 such buildings on concrete slab foundations, and measured vertical displacements or settlements at multiple locations in order to identify maximum differential movements and maximum slope of the concrete slab. So that measured slope is now plotted against the severity of liquefaction observed on the property for 5 different categories, from no liquefaction, low liquefaction to very severe liquefaction. Shown here with the dashed line is the no damage criterion based on the New Zealand Department of Building and Housing, and based on this criteria we can see that these foundations had acceptable performance in areas of no liquefaction, maybe marginal performance in areas of low liquefaction, and inadequate performance in areas of moderate or severe liquefaction. Clearly, the foundation damage is related to liquefaction severity, as was the case for various engineering structures indeed. Now, as I mentioned previously, 60,000 residential buildings were affected by liquefaction, and 20,000 of those were affected seriously. So there was a comprehensive program developed by the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, together with the engineering community, to address the repairs of these residential properties. And the first thing that was done was they conducted land zoning and divided land into 3 different technical categories. TC1, shown here with gray, are areas where there wasn't any serious land damage, and for that reason existing or previous provisions could be used. Then TC2 areas, shown in yellow, where there was minor to moderate land damage, and in those areas TC2 foundations were recommended, and those were having improved stiffness and strength. They were trying to minimize or reduce differential movements due to liquefaction, to reduce lateral loads associated with differential movements and spreading effects, and also to allow for easy repair and releveling of houses in case of future liquefaction events. And so this was one of the key strategies, really, to try to have a foundation that can be easily repaired and can relevel the building in case of differential movements in future events. The third category was where major land damage occurred, the TC3 category, and in those areas special TC3 foundations are considered and geotechnical considerations with performance objectives similar to the TC2 areas that I just outlined. And of course in red we are showing here the red residential zone. There are some red areas in the Port Hills as well, but it is predominantly along the Avon River. Those are the abandoned residential areas, as I mentioned previously, primarily due to the increased flooding hazard and issues associated with lateral spreading. So I'm going to now quickly go through to illustrate key effects of liquefaction on the multi-story CBD buildings. And this is an aerial view of the CBD, where the prevalent soils in the top 7-8 meters are shown, and they illustrate the typical Christchurch ground environment with high variability both horizontally and vertically of soils. So for example here at the northwest part we have soft peaty soils, then southwest we've got shallow gravels, and here along this stretch where red color is shown we have predominantly sands, and this is actually the area that manifested moderate to severe liquefaction in the CBD during the February earthquake. So many of the buildings on shallow and deep foundations were affected by liquefaction in this area. And we've conducted some detailed investigations. Now it's interesting that this area coincides with the area where we have former river channels and former streams and waterways, and quite often we found that actually close to these features the manifestation of liquefaction was the most severe. So we've investigated several case studies in detail, first to document the damage. This is a joint effort together with UC Berkeley and Jonathan Bray in particular. So we've identified several case studies that you can see here where our investigation efforts are concentrated, and they include detailed field investigations using closely spaced CPTs. Now each of these symbols indicate a location of a CPT. In addition to that, we've been recovering undisturbed samples for testing in the laboratory. So here is one of those case studies, and this is a 6-story building on a shallow foundation. There was a clear liquefaction manifestation on the parking lot here with some water and sand ejecta, and this liquefaction feature affected the southeast corner of the building. The building exhibited differential settlements where this corner settled 26 centimeters relative to the northeast corner. At this part of the building there wasn't any a manifestation of liquefaction or ground distress or differential movements between the structure and the ground. So in the lower part of the figure we are summarizing our CPT investigations, including simplified liquefaction triggering analysis, and it is now indicating, this analysis is indicating that some deep liquefaction should have developed during the February earthquake at depths greater than 10 meters at this northeast end of the building, and we can see similarly some deep liquefaction should have developed during this event on the southeast edge of the building as well. But the key difference is that at this part of the building there is a shallow liquefaction developing in a layer which is immediately below the foundation, and this layer was actually responsible for the liquefaction ejecta that was seen around this corner of the building, as well as for the substantial differential settlements that were observed. So we are seeing a clear difference in the effects of deep liquefaction and shallow liquefaction, where deep liquefaction may probably result in some global settlements, but not large disturbance around the shallow foundation, whereas the shallow foundation really affects directly the immediate foundation soils, causing large differential settlements. There were several other buildings exhibiting this type of effects of shallow liquefaction, which was manifested typically in large differential settlements, or in some cases punch-through failures through a very thin crust layer into the underlying liquefied soil. So clearly the location of the liquefied layer is very important, and the proximity to foundation is increasing the damaging effects of liquefaction. This is another 6-story building, but now this one is on deep foundations. The piles are 15-16 meters long, and in this area very severe effects of liquefaction occurred during the February and then in June 2011 as well, so during those two events. In February, the soil surrounding the building settled approximately 30 centimeters at this end and close to 20 centimeters at the other end of the building. And you can see now this large vertical offset between the ground that settled for 30 centimeters and the building obviously didn't settle much, and this is the beam connecting the pile caps, because the beam was on deep foundations and was supported at depth of up to 15-16 meters below the ground surface. You can see now this offset of the beam, foundation beam, and the surrounding soil, as well as the parking lot is trapping the cars, because before the earthquakes clearly this was a flat ground surface. There was additional settlement in this part of 20 centimeters during the June event, where the total settlement reached about 50 centimeters. So this clearly shows the dramatic difference in the performance of shallow and deep foundations in liquefied soils. Now, this building was demolished due to structural considerations, and unfortunately we don't have details about the performance of the piles and damage to the piles caused in these events. The final point to mention about the performance of multi-story buildings is shown here, where a number of high-rise buildings were showing a permanent or residual tilt after the earthquakes. And of course, this is very difficult to deal with because of the large buildings and difficulties to recover and re-level these kind of buildings. There were traces of liquefaction, so some evidence of minor liquefaction, I would say, which was probably contributing to some extent to this outcome. But we have to keep in mind that there are a range of factors really influencing the dynamic response of these buildings, including their dynamic behavior, interaction between building, soil, building interaction, very complex foundations that we've had for those buildings, in particular for this one here, non-uniformity of ground conditions across the footprint of the building. So those are all issues contributing to the residual tilt, but clearly geotechnical conditions and ground response was one of the key contributing factors. Now, bridges in Christchurch were affected in a very specific way and consistent way, and I'm going to use the bridges along the Avon River to illustrate the characteristic effects of lateral spreading on the bridges in Christchurch. Now, the spreading displacements were relatively small in the CBD, up to 30, 40, 50 centimeters. They reached about 1 meter at the Avon Loop, and then from the CBD up to the estuary, the bridges were exposed to lateral spreading displacements on the order of half a meter, 2 or 3 meters, depending on the particular location and ground conditions. So I'm going to use a couple of case studies, the South Brighton Bridge and the Anzac Bridge, to illustrate some of the key mechanisms and damage patterns. Before that, I will introduce the mechanism itself, and for that the key feature is that the bridges in Christchurch are short, medium-length bridges of 25 to 50 meters long, typically, and they have 2 or 3 spans and have a very robust and sturdy superstructure, very stiff and strong superstructure. So when lateral spreading occurred and pretty much produced very large ground displacement, resulting in large ground displacements and closing of the river banks towards the river, this stiff and robust superstructure resisted those movements and reduced the ground displacements at the approaches as well as in the foundation soils at the abutments. Now, this produced some strutting mechanism, and since the bridge superstructure prevented any displacement at the level of the deck, the foundations were obviously not as stiff and strong, so there was deformation in the foundation soils and foundations themselves, so there was inward rotation of the abutments, which in turn pushed the piles towards the river and bended the piles, producing typical deformation patterns and damage to the piles. This was really consistently observed for all bridges along Avon River and Heathcote River for that matter, the only difference being the amount of this abutment rotation or displacement of the pile and damage levels to the piles. So let's examine some of the details of this mechanism by using a couple of case studies. The first one is the South Brighton Bridge, where the lateral spreading displacements were 2 to 3 meters. And this is a side view of the bridge, so we are having a large lateral spreading displacements of 2 to 3 meters attacking this area in the bridge. But we can see the very robust superstructure, the RC deck with I-beams, and if we zoom in in the contact area between the abutment and the I-beam. We are seeing here the collision point around which the abutment rotated. So this is a permanent rotation of 8 degrees that pushed the piles towards the river and damaged the piles. As we can see here on the river side, there are nice horizontal cracks associated with bending of the pile. And so here are the horizontal bending cracks on the river side of the pile, and on the land side of the pile we can see concrete crushing and spalling consistent with the compressional stresses and deformation at the land side of the pile. It is also apparent that there is some ground distress in the foundation soils between the abutment piles, indicating lateral displacements of the foundation soil towards the river. So it's really important to understand what is the size of this ground displacement within the piles in relation to the free-field displacements of the river banks. And the ISSMGE bridge provides an excellent case study giving us the details of those movements. As you can see here, this is the south approach of the ISSMGE bridge, where you can see large sand boils illustrating moderate to severe liquefaction in this area, accompanied with lateral spreading. The spreading in the free field was about 1 meter. And again, the bridge exhibited the same mechanism associated with deck strutting, inward rotation of the abutments of 6 degrees in this case, displacement of the top of the abutment piles of about 20 centimeters at the top of the piles. And as you can see here, the displacement of the spreading displacements in the free field were about 1 meter. Now this pedestrian underpass was on short piles, which was floating practically within the liquefied soils, and hence is providing a good estimate for the displacement of the foundation soils. Its displacement was somewhere between 40 to 60 centimeters. So we are seeing that the foundation soils have substantially smaller free-field displacements than the free-field displacement. So they are approximately 50% of the free-field displacement. We've conducted comprehensive pseudostatic analysis using single pile models and whole bridge models to investigate first the accuracy of this analysis method to capture the mechanism of deformation, deformation levels and damage levels for different components of the bridge and the piles in particular, and also to conduct a series of sensitivity studies in order to investigate what are the key parameters in the analysis that control the pile response. We have identified that indeed these analyses were capable of explaining the observed mechanisms and deformation patterns, and were providing levels of damage consistent with the observations from the field damage inspections. And we've identified from the sensitivity analysis that the key parameters controlling the pile response were the magnitude of ground displacement, or UG here, hence the great importance of the reduction of foundation displacements of the foundation soils that we just saw was 50% of the free field displacements. And the second key parameter was really associated with the parameters controlling the ultimate load from the crust non-liquefiable layer near the ground surface. And of course, the boundary condition imposed by the bridge structure were very important to be modeled in the single pile analysis. Well, they were captured in the whole bridge analysis, which is shown here by definition because we were modeling all components there. So you can see here in the whole bridge analysis now spreading displacements are applied to both abutments of different magnitude and distribution, and then there are some spreading displacements applied to the pier piles. These are now this is showing the deformed shape of the abutment piles and the piers, the abutments themselves and the piers. And we see here bending moments along the pier piles and bending moments along the piers themselves, with values somewhere between cracking and yield levels at the top of the piers, which were consistent with the observed damage levels for this bridge. So very encouraging results from the pseudostatic analysis. So in summary, we've observed a characteristic spreading-induced deformation and damage mechanism for bridges, in which a strong and robust and sturdy superstructure was critical, because it produced a deck strutting mechanism, which in turn resulted in inward rotation of the abutment, displacements and deformation of the piles and consequent damage of the piles. We found that the displacements of the foundation soils were much smaller than the free field spreading displacements, and they were approximately 50% of the free field displacements. So finally, I will conclude with very brief remarks on the impacts of liquefaction on pipe networks, and I'm going to use 3 different pipe networks to illustrate these effects. The first one is the potable water network of Christchurch, which actually consists of 2 networks, networks of mains and sub-mains. The mains are predominantly pipes with diameters of 100 to 600 millimeters at depths of 0.8 to 1.5 meters. So we are seeing here the network of the water mains. It has close to 2,000 kilometers of pipes. Most of them are asbestos cement pipes, as you can see here, and there are PVC pipes, which are more flexible pipelines, also contribute to this network. So the solid symbols here are indicating the locations where failures occurred. So those are locations of pipe breaks, and we can see that those are largely coincide with the areas where moderate to severe liquefaction was observed. Indeed, 80% of the damage to the water mains occurred in areas that liquefied, and more than half were in areas where moderate to severe liquefaction was observed. There is a clear effect of the liquefaction severity on the performance of individual pipe types. So this is for PVC pipes, where we can see that 8% of those PVC pipes were damaged in areas of moderate to severe liquefaction, 4% in low to moderate liquefaction, and there was very little damage in areas that did not liquefy. On the other hand, so the PVC pipes are flexible because they have socketed joints, which allow some differential movements between adjacent segments. And their performance was much better when we compare their performance with the performance of asbestos cement pipes. In the case of asbestos cement pipes, 20% of the pipes were damaged in areas of moderate to severe liquefaction, then around 9% damage in low to moderate, and there was even 5-6% damage in areas of no liquefaction. So these are really brittle materials and pipelines that cannot accommodate differential ground movements and displacement associated with liquefaction. So clear difference and better performance of ductile materials and flexible pipelines as compared to brittle materials and pipelines. The second network is the wastewater system, which was hit really hard by these earthquakes. We can see here that in the central part of the city, which was developed by the 1950s or so, predominantly we have earthenware pipes or ceramic pipes, and then in the 1960s and 70s we have predominance of concrete pipes. So they are all brittle material pipes and pipelines. They are embedded between 2 and 3.5 meters depth, so deeper. That means more difficult to access and repair. So this system was really heavily affected by liquefaction, causing breaks of pipes, infiltration of sand in pipelines. And also additional feature was that since 90% of the system is gravity driven, there was a loss of grade due to differential movements induced by liquefaction, which reversed the flow and affected seriously the functionality of the system. So this is the service status of the system. 1 month after the February earthquake, so this is for March 2011, where red lines indicate no service, so 140 kilometers were out of service, and over 540 kilometers of these pipelines the service was limited. And again, we can see that really the worst affected areas are the areas where moderate to severe liquefaction was observed. And finally, I will complete with the third network on a good note. This is now the gas distribution system, 170 kilometers of pipelines, but these are medium density polyethylene pipes with electrofusion welds. And these are now very ductile materials that allow for large ground deformation and can actually, even if strained within several percent, they can still keep their functionality. So practically there wasn't damage on this pipeline network, though we have to say that the exposure of this network to the worst affected areas of moderate to severe liquefaction was less than in the previous two cases, but still there was dramatically improved performance because of the capability of these flexible pipelines to accommodate large ground deformation associated with liquefaction. So I will make now just brief concluding remarks. During the 2010 and 2011 Christchurch earthquakes, we've observed extensive and very severe liquefaction of fine sands and silty sands with low plasticity or non-plastic fines. Given the seismic intensity or seismic demand caused by these earthquakes and the high liquefaction potential, this wasn't really surprising. However, the effects were still unprecedented because of the urban setting and effects on buildings, infrastructure, and indeed very serious impacts on the residents of Christchurch. There are several important factors that I would like to point out. The first one is related to effects of soil properties on liquefaction manifestation in relation to fine sands and silty sands, as well as state of the soil in terms of density and fabric effects. Well, I would say that in this context, particularly important for us are the silty soils in the range between clearly liquefiable sands and silts and non-liquefiable soils, silty soils, let's say in the gray zone, because understanding of their behavior both in relation to liquefaction triggering and liquefaction manifestation and damaging effects of liquefaction is very important and requires further research and better characterization of the behavior of these soils. The second is related to the stratification of the deposits, and the first important effect there was of a non-liquefiable crust at the ground surface. When this crust has a sufficient thickness, integrity and quality and provides some lateral continuity and stiffness, the manifestation and damaging effects of liquefaction were significantly reduced. However, it's also important what is beneath that crust. We are seeing a clear difference between uniform and continuous deposits where we have thick, continuous liquefiable soils beneath a thin crust. In those cases, the manifestation and damaging effects of liquefaction are quite severe, as opposed to cases where we are having stratified deposits in which the liquefied layers are sandwiched between non-liquefied layers or layers of lower potential for liquefaction, in which case we are seeing much smaller manifestation and reduced damaging effects of liquefaction. And in that context, clearly the location of the critical liquefiable layer within the profile is very important, and it was evident in Christchurch that shallow liquefaction was very damaging for near surface structures. We also observed some characteristic patterns for lateral spreading displacements and distribution of those displacements, and found that they are closely linked to the key features of the critical layers responsible for such spreading displacements. The effects of liquefaction on structures, well, obviously shallow liquefaction was very damaging for buildings and residential buildings and CBD buildings on shallow foundations, which is clearly due to proximity of the liquefied layer to the foundation itself. We also saw characteristic damage patterns for bridges associated with spreading, where a deck strutting mechanism created by a very robust and sturdy superstructure resulted in inward rotation of abutments, displacement of piles, and bending and damage to piles consistent with this mechanism. And also there was a slumping of approaches and vertical offsets being created between the approaches and the pile supported deck. And finally, for networks, we are seeing that flexible pipelines and materials and connection details that can accommodate differential ground movements associated with liquefaction performed much better than systems which are brittle and cannot accommodate such movements without failures. So at the very end, I would just outline again that clearly ground deformation and ground failures were key factors in the performance of buildings and infrastructure, as well as in terms of impacts of the Christchurch earthquakes on the people of Christchurch. I would just also suggest that in addition to all these factors that I've outlined before, and in addition to individual design considerations and geotechnical evaluations, it is really important to consider effects which are associated with system performances, such as the bridge response in relation to lateral spreading that I outlined. Then, for example, the response of CBD buildings, we are having building, foundation, soil, building interaction. So again, that could be considered as a system in the evaluation. Performance of networks crossing the city and different ground conditions and levels of ground deformation, performance of different suburbs, interdependencies of networks and different systems, or consideration of urban systems, if you like, because such considerations are critical for achieving adequate levels of resilience against extreme earthquake events, as were the 2010-2011 Christchurch earthquakes. Well, with this, I would just like to acknowledge the contribution of many people, and first and foremost the dedication and efforts of my postgraduate students and postdoctoral fellows, the collaboration of Tom O'Rourke on the issues related to lifelines, Jonathan Bray on CBD and silty soils issues, and Russell Green on liquefaction triggering and damage indices. And finally, I would like to acknowledge EQC and Tonkin and Taylor for providing several of their slides related to their work. With this, I would like to conclude the webinar, and thank you for your attention. As you have heard in the introduction, I will be happy to answer your questions related to this presentation. Thank you.